The 1970s were a wild frontier for British cinema. Censorship boards were on high alert, newspapers screamed about moral decay, and theaters nervously debated whether certain films should even be shown to the public. Yet, beneath the outrage, a strange and fascinating movement was growing. British exploitation films pushed boundaries with shocking violence, controversial sexuality, and taboo subjects that mainstream studios wouldn't touch. Many were made on tiny budgets, shot quickly, and distributed through grindhouse theaters or late-night screenings. Censors cut them, banned them, or buried them completely. But controversy has a way of creating legend. Over time, these films slipped from scandal into cult status, rediscovered by collectors, horror historians, and fans of raw, unfiltered cinema. These are 10 rare British exploitation films from the 1970s that shocked censors and built underground reputations decades later. Deathline, 1972. Deathline delivers one of the most unsettling urban horror stories ever produced in Britain. Directed by Gary Sherman, the film takes place within the dark tunnels of the London Underground, where a long-forgotten secret has been quietly surviving for decades. When commuters begin disappearing, authorities discover that a group of cannibalistic descendants from Victorian tunnel workers has been living beneath the city. The concept alone alarmed censors who feared audiences would find the imagery too disturbing. Yet Sherman approaches the material with a surprising amount of empathy, portraying the monstrous survivor as a tragic figure shaped by abandonment and isolation. The gritty depiction of London in the early 70s adds authenticity, capturing a grim urban atmosphere far removed from polished studio productions. Donald Pleasance delivers a memorable performance as a cynical police inspector investigating the case. Though the film struggled commercially during its original release, it later became a cult favorite among horror fans who appreciated its raw tone and emotional complexity. Deathline remains one of the boldest British exploitation films ever set beneath the streets of London. Frightmare, 1974. Pete Walker's Frightmare shocked British audiences with its chilling depiction of a seemingly ordinary elderly woman hiding a terrifying secret. Beneath the surface of suburban respectability lies a former cannibalistic killer recently released from a mental institution. Walker crafts the story like a twisted domestic drama, slowly revealing the disturbing habits that still linger beneath polite tea conversations and family visits. What makes the film so unsettling is how casually it blends everyday life with grotesque horror. Violence erupts without warning, and the quiet British countryside suddenly feels claustrophobic and unsafe. Censors were deeply uncomfortable with the film's combination of cannibalism, family dysfunction, and psychological manipulation. Several territories demanded edits before allowing it to be screened. Walker's low-budget approach adds to the grim realism, making the story feel less like fantasy and more like a dark secret hiding behind suburban curtains. Over time, Frightmare became one of the most infamous titles in Britain's exploitation horror movement, praised by cult film enthusiasts for its fearless storytelling and chilling atmosphere that lingers long after the final scene fades. Prey, 1977. Few British exploitation films feel as bizarre and unsettling as Prey. Directed by Norman J. Warren, the story begins with what appears to be a quiet domestic drama involving two women living in an isolated countryside home. Their peaceful routine is disrupted when a mysterious man arrives claiming to have lost his memory. What follows quickly spirals into something far stranger. The visitor is revealed to be an alien predator studying human behavior before deciding whether to consume the entire species. The film blends science fiction, horror, and provocative sexuality in ways that made censors deeply uncomfortable. Scenes of psychological manipulation and predatory violence blur the line between seduction and survival. Warren shot the film on a very limited budget, relying heavily on atmosphere and character tension rather than elaborate effects. Because of its unusual tone and controversial themes, Prey struggled to find proper distribution during its original release. Over time, however, fans of cult cinema rediscovered its eerie originality. Today, it is celebrated as one of the strangest and most daring British exploitation films of the 1970s. The Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971. Released at the height of Britain's folk horror boom, The Blood on Satan's Claw
unsettled Censors with its disturbing blend of occult terror and rural innocence corrupted. The story unfolds in an isolated 18th century English village where strange demonic forces begin infecting the youth of the community. What begins as a quiet period mystery quickly spirals into ritualistic horror involving possession, pagan ceremonies, and shocking acts of violence. Director Piers Haggard avoided flashy special effects, instead leaning into a creeping atmosphere of dread that made the film feel disturbingly real. The countryside setting, normally associated with calm tradition, becomes a breeding ground for paranoia and moral collapse. Several scenes involving cult rituals and young characters were considered deeply controversial at the time, forcing censorship boards to intervene. Despite limited promotion and distribution, the film gradually developed a loyal following among horror fans. Today, it stands as one of the most haunting and influential British folk horror films ever made, remembered for its unsettling tone and the way it quietly transformed pastoral England into a landscape of pure nightmare.
The Flesh and Blood Show, 1972. Pete Walker appears again on this list with The Flesh and Blood Show, a film that mixes murder mystery, exploitation thrills, and theatrical melodrama into one controversial package. The story follows a group of young actors rehearsing a play in a decaying seaside theater, unaware that a killer is hiding within the building's dark corridors. Walker uses the setting to create a tense atmosphere where rehearsal scenes blur with real danger. What disturbed censors most was the film's willingness to combine graphic violence with scenes of nudity and backstage voyeurism. The decaying theater itself becomes a character, representing the crumbling state of traditional British entertainment as a new, more provocative era begins to emerge. Walker's direction emphasizes suspense rather than spectacle, allowing the mystery to slowly unfold while tension builds between the characters. Although the film received mixed reactions upon release, it gradually built a reputation among horror collectors and genre enthusiasts. Today, it stands as one of the defining examples of British 70s exploitation cinema, remembered for its eerie setting and fearless blending of theatrical drama with grindhouse horror elements. The House That Dripped Blood, 1971. Anthology horror was popular during the early 70s, but The House That Dripped Blood pushed the format into darker territory that unsettled censors. Produced by Amicus Productions, the film presents 4 chilling stories linked by a mysterious house where every new resident faces a different nightmare. The cast features familiar British icons, including Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, yet the tone is far more sinister than the studio's earlier Gothic productions. Each segment explores psychological dread, supernatural manipulation, and violent twists that slowly escalate toward a disturbing finale. The film's title alone promised outrageous gore, which worried censorship boards, even though the horror relied more on tension than explicit violence. Audiences expecting traditional Hammer-style Gothic drama instead encountered something stranger and more experimental. While it wasn't a massive box office success, its eerie storytelling and clever structure helped it gain recognition among genre fans. Over the years, it became a staple of late-night horror television and retro film festivals. Today, it remains a beloved cult classic, representing the strange, boundary-pushing creativity of Britain's exploitation cinema era.
Symptoms, 1974. Symptoms is one of the most atmospheric psychological horror films produced in Britain during the 70s. Directed by José Ramón Larraz, the story follows a woman invited to stay at a secluded country mansion where strange behavior and hidden trauma slowly surface. Instead of relying on conventional horror tropes, the film focuses on isolation, mental instability, and the fragile relationship between its 2 central characters. The tension grows quietly as paranoia begins to replace trust. Censors struggled with the film's ambiguous psychological themes and subtle depiction of repressed desire, which were considered provocative at the time. Larraz uses long stretches of silence and slow camera movements to create an oppressive mood where every sound feels threatening. Although the film initially disappeared from circulation for many years due to distribution issues, horror historians eventually rediscovered it. Today, Symptoms is praised for its haunting atmosphere and complex character study. Its slow-burning tension stands in sharp contrast to more sensational exploitation films, proving that psychological unease can be just as shocking as explicit violence when handled with patience and precision. The Devils, 1971. Few British films in history have sparked as much censorship controversy as The Devils. Directed by Ken Russell, the film dramatizes the true story of a 17th-century French priest accused of witchcraft during a wave of mass hysteria. Russell's bold visual style and fearless storytelling created a shocking blend of religious satire, political commentary, and disturbing imagery. Scenes depicting exorcisms, corruption within the church, and intense psychological breakdowns horrified censorship boards around the world. Several countries banned the film outright, while others demanded extensive cuts before allowing limited screenings. Oliver Reed delivers an explosive performance as Father Grandier, capturing the character's defiance in the face of institutional persecution. The film's elaborate production design and theatrical staging give it a surreal quality that intensifies the chaos unfolding on screen. Despite its troubled release, The Devils gradually gained recognition as a daring work of cinematic art. Today, it is widely considered one of the most controversial yet fascinating British films ever made, standing as a powerful example of how exploitation themes can collide with historical drama and artistic ambition.
Vampires, 1974. Vampires became one of the most notorious erotic horror films of the decade when it premiered in 1974. Directed by José Ramón Larraz, the story centers on two seductive female vampires who lure unsuspecting travelers to an isolated countryside mansion. Unlike traditional Gothic vampire stories, the film embraces explicit sexuality and unapologetic brutality, which immediately alarmed censorship boards. The vampires are portrayed not as tragic monsters, but as dangerous predators who manipulate their victims with charm and deception. Larraz's direction emphasizes atmosphere and sensual tension rather than flashy special effects. The quiet rural setting adds to the sense of isolation, making every encounter feel increasingly dangerous. Because of its provocative content, the film faced heavy censorship in several regions and struggled to secure mainstream distribution. However, underground audiences embraced its daring tone and unconventional storytelling. Over time, Vampires became a staple of cult horror collections, admired for its hypnotic mood and fearless approach to vampire mythology. Today, it remains one of the most distinctive examples of British 70s exploitation cinema. The Wicker Man, 1973. Although now considered a classic of British cinema, The Wicker Man was initially treated as a risky and controversial project. Directed by Robin Hardy, the film follows a devout Christian police officer investigating a missing child on a remote Scottish island. What he discovers is a pagan community practicing ancient rituals that challenge everything he believes. The film's exploration of religion, sexuality, and cultural conflict disturbed censors who feared audiences might find its themes offensive or blasphemous. Rather than relying on traditional horror monsters, the story builds tension through psychological manipulation and cultural clash. Edward Woodward delivers a powerful performance as the increasingly desperate investigator struggling to understand the island's strange traditions. The haunting folk music and rural setting create an eerie atmosphere that slowly builds toward one of the most shocking endings in horror history. Though it initially suffered from poor distribution and studio interference, The Wicker Man eventually became one of the most celebrated cult films ever made. Today, it is recognized as a masterpiece of folk horror and a defining example of British 70s exploitation cinema.
The 1970s proved that British cinema wasn't afraid to disturb, provoke, and challenge its audiences. These films pushed past the limits of what censors were willing to tolerate. Some were banned, some were cut, and some nearly vanished entirely. But controversy kept them alive long enough to be rediscovered. Today, they survive as rare cult classics from one of the boldest eras in film history.